What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Recently, a lot of you heathens out there have sent me a video by Metatron. He did an analysis of the evidence for historical Jesus, and y'all wanted to know what I thought about his video. The short answer is, it was horribly lazy. If y'all want to fuck around and find out what my complete take is on Metatron's analysis of the historical evidence for Jesus, then please stay tuned. Today's video is brought to you by CHRESTUS. CHRESTUS is an app that I took over and have improved over the last couple of years that gives you a lot of great information about the topics that we're covering today, namely the historical references to Jesus. So if you want to know more about the references that are going to be brought up in today's video, definitely go and download the CHRESTUS app today. This response is going to be broken up into two different videos. The first video is only concerned with his analysis of the evidence for Jesus. The second video is going to cover his mistakes in trying to date the birth and crucifixion of Jesus. Today on How Metatron Fucked Up, we're going to be looking at his analysis of the evidence, or I should say his analysis, because it really wasn't an analysis. Metatron starts with a straw man argument against mythicists. This is pretty much indicative of the kind of information he's going to provide in the video.
Hey noble ones, on this video I'd like to talk about the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth, as reported by the ancient Romans, or as his name was probably pronounced in his language, Yeshua. Some people try to prove he existed at all costs, accepting all evidence a priori. Others try to prove he didn't, refuting all evidence without even looking into the actual context.
This is a straw man wrapped in a false dichotomy. Those are not the two positions that exist. There are a lot of historicists out there that take an honest look at the evidence for Jesus and don't accept all of the references. But on the mythicist side, I'm not exactly sure who he's talking about, because the insinuation is that we haven't looked into the context of these references. It kind of seems like he's only highlighting the worst possible positions on either side of the argument. Instead, he should be addressing the strongest possible positions. I feel like this starts out the video by highlighting exactly how lazy Metatron seems to be in researching and producing this video. So after this point, he goes on to discuss his methodology.
This is a critical historical investigation, so I will try to be as unbiased as possible, even though implicit bias, unconscious bias is inevitable to a certain extent. I'll do my best to be as fair as possible in my evaluation of the ancient sources, some of which we will read in the original Latin, and draw a picture of how solid of a historical figure Jesus actually was.
I find his very last statement there to be very telling, because what he's doing is he's starting with his conclusion that there was a historical Jesus, and then he's working backwards from it. You can't say that you're about to conduct a critical historical investigation of a subject but then start the video off with your conclusion. He claims he's just going to be looking at what the ancient Romans said about Jesus and not try to push any of his personal beliefs onto us. Although, with a name like Metatron, I can't help but to wonder if he applies this principle loosely.
First, the actual, historically most plausible date of birth of Jesus of Nazareth, which is now most historians agree that it's not going to be 1 AD, it's a different date, and I'll tell you about it, I'll justify it historically, and secondly, the most probable date of his actual crucifixion. And these are important for the following reason. Usually people who try to disprove the existence of historical Jesus use these 2 points of argument.
After this point, he goes on to painstakingly prove in his worldview that Jesus was born in 4 BCE. He just totally ignores the fact that Luke's gospel places Jesus' birth a whole 10 years after Matthew's gospel. Instead, he assumes the census in Luke was taken at a time when Quirinius was not the governor of Syria. Quirinius was fighting a military campaign from 12 BCE to 1 CE. So in order to mesh both Luke and Matthew together, he has to ignore information contained in Luke. His historical analysis game seems to be really off right from the start. if he has to go in and ignore certain portions of Luke without good reason. If he had provided a solid reason as to why we couldn't trust Luke when he says that Jesus was born during the time that Quirinius was governor, then I wouldn't have a problem. But he doesn't do that. He just ignores it without reason. He also cherry picks a lot of information concerning Jesus' crucifixion, but we'll get into that later. But for this video, let's just focus on how he handles the evidence for Jesus. I guess specifically just the Roman evidence. He's not going to be looking at anything that's contained within the Bible. That would be Paul's works or the Gospels, which, in my own personal opinion, kind of neuters him a little bit on the historical Jesus, because Paul is really the best evidence that you can have for a historical Jesus. There's so many ambiguous verses in there that you could definitely argue are speaking of a historical Jesus. Now, I'm not convinced of those arguments, but you can still argue for that position. If he thinks that he can use Roman sources in order to prove that Jesus existed in history, he's going to have a bad time. All right, so the first source he's going to cover is Tacitus. He does go through and read all these sources in their original languages, mainly Latin. I don't see what benefit that really gives us unless you're doing like a critical text analysis or anything like that. I really don't understand what the point is in reading it other than he's showing off his Latin skills, but we're just going to get to the conclusions of each of his analyses of the sources. So let's see what he thinks about Tacitus.
Okay, so let's discuss the validity. Most scholars consider Tacitus' explanation and mentions of Jesus and his execution to be of high historical value, and it is generally considered to be an authentic, independent Roman source.
I don't know what scholars he's talking about here. Robert Van Voorst and R.T. France both agree that this is not an independent source for Jesus. Does this Testimonium Tacitum therefore provide definitive evidence of the existence of Jesus? If we could be certain that Tacitus's account was based on non-Christian sources, the answer would be yes. But as we have seen, such independent knowledge is unverifiable. As R.T. France concludes, while the evidence from Tacitus corroborates the New Testament accounts of the death of Jesus, by itself it cannot prove the events happened as Tacitus has been informed, or even the existence of Jesus. This latter, France correctly argues, has abundant persuasive evidence in the New Testament. Tacitus, careful historian that he was, presumed the existence of Jesus and had no reason to doubt it. Robert Van Voorst, Jesus outside the New Testament. Without knowing what scholars he seems to be talking about here, it's hard for me to refute this notion that a majority of scholars feel that this is a historical reference to Jesus. To my knowledge, a majority of reasonable scholars in this field don't take Tacitus to be an independent account of Jesus. So I am just totally confused by what he is claiming here.
To add to that, you have to remember that when Tacitus wrote history, if he considered the information that he was presented to be not entirely reliable, such as hearsay or something that he hadn't witnessed himself, he would normally add indications for the readers. No such indication has been added to this specific mention.
Normally this would be true, but the absence of such a clarification does not immediately indicate that the information is true to history. It just means that Tacitus was reporting information he believed to be true. If he got his information from anywhere, it would have been from Pliny the Younger. So I don't know why Tacitus would have thought it wasn't true. So this fact that Metatron brings up does nothing to prove that Tacitus is an independent reference to Jesus. As Robert Van Voorst and R.T. France mentioned previously, there was no reason for Tacitus to doubt this information.
As a negative point, however, I do need to mention the fact that no original manuscript from Tacitus is preserved to this day, and the majority of what we have are copies, or we should say later copies, some of which were made by Christian monks. Now, were the contents of this message changed or altered in any way by the medieval monks that were copying this manuscript into their own abbey? Well, of course, we can't know for sure. Most historians agree that the message is authentic.
I agree that the interpolation hypothesis for the highly Christian parts of Tacitus is somewhat of a minority position, but I do feel like it's a well-supported position. But that particular line in Tacitus doesn't have to be interpolated for my position to be sound. Tacitus would have gotten his information from Pliny the Younger, who was investigating Christians and their beliefs in the next province over from Tacitus, and therefore wouldn't have questioned this information. Considering that both Pliny the Younger and Tacitus were both writing in the 2nd century, the gospel information was well known in the Christian community. So the fact that Christians, knowing this information, was informing Pliny the Younger, who was therefore informing Tacitus about Christian beliefs, means that the Gospels are the ultimate source for this information in Tacitus. So, if Metatron is not going to use the Gospels or Paul as evidence that Jesus existed in history, then he shouldn't use Tacitus either.
However, I do need to point out that a spelling correction did happen. Some sort of alteration did occur. In fact, at the time, 2 kinds of spellings and 2 kinds of words to speak about Christians were used. Christianos with an I and Christianos with an E. The medieval version instead will always be Christianos with an I, and we notice that there is a space in one of the 2 manuscripts between the I used for Cri and the Stianos, and that is because originally probably was written with an E, which would have filled the gap, but that was removed as a form of correction by monks. So yes, some alteration happened, but most scholars believe that the message is authentic.
So typically at this point, it's very common for apologists to say that the misspelling of Christians or Christ with Chrestus and Christians was a very common thing that happened, and it was a way to insult the Christian. This would all make sense if it was a vulgar writer, and by that I don't mean that he just swears a lot. I just mean that this is a less sophisticated writer. But the problem with this is that Tacitus is a very educated writer that wrote in a very sophisticated Greek. You wouldn't see such a common spelling mistake in Tacitus's work. What this means is that Tacitus is actually referring to Chrestus here. That would be the Jewish instigator that existed around the 50s that's mentioned by Suetonius. And this Jewish instigator caused a lot of ruckus. This is one reason why the interpolation hypothesis makes sense here. The section of Tacitus that describes Jesus of the Gospels can be taken out without hurting Tacitus's message. This is just one sign of a potential interpolation. But all in all, Metatron seems to accept that this is an independent reference to Jesus. I don't know why though, because even if we accept that Tacitus wrote the highly Christianized portion of his reference, he would have ultimately gotten that information from Christians and thus the Gospels. This taints Tacitus as being a non-independent source because it's dependent on the Gospels. Strike 1, Metatron. Alright, so next, Metatron is going to handle the Josephus references. First up is the Testimonium Flavianum.
Now, of course, this is a very powerful testimony, but we are not 100% sure if we can fully trust it. Most of the testimony has very strong historical validity, but a Jewish man who had defected into Rome, calling Jesus the Messiah, and specifically speaking about the resurrection after 3 days, are thought to be maybe Christian alterations. It is, however, widely accepted that this testimony originally consisted of an authentic nucleus with a reference to the execution of Jesus by Pilate, which was then the subject to interpolation.
Yeah, but that consensus is primarily made up of Christian scholars. So yeah, they would definitely shuck doing even the smallest amount of critical source analysis. A few key things to know about this reference in Josephus is that Alice Wheely has actually proven that no previous version of this particular reference exists. She traced the history of the Syriac and Arabic versions, which are the less Christianized versions that are normally touted out by apologists as being earlier versions of the Testimonium Flavianum. She proved that they all ultimately trace back to Eusebius, which is the current extant version that we have. So no other version exists, and it would be pure speculation to suggest that an earlier, less Christian version of the Testimonium Flavianum exists. Considering this, Paul Hopper has done a literary analysis on the construction of the Testimonium Flavianum, and he has found that the writing contained within is very different from how Josephus writes altogether. It uses verbs differently, it structures its story differently, and many other things that shows that Josephus most likely didn't write this passage. To add insult to injury, G.J. Goldberg has investigated this particular passage and has found that it's pretty much modeled off the Emmaus Road story contained in Luke's Gospel. Both Ken Olson and Louis Feldman have been able to show that a Christian like Eusebius probably wrote the passage. Every single aspect of this reference seems to point away from Josephus. Given all this information, it's amazing to me that Metatron doesn't seem to do even the slightest bit of critical analysis or historical research on these references. He claims to have read what the majority consensus is on this particular reference, but he fails to address any of the criticisms that are levied against this consensus. Not only this, but he doesn't even list any historians that agree with his point. He also doesn't address that everyone, or the consensus, is made up of a majority of Christians that are controlled by statements of faith.
Now, this is a very big discussion, and I can't really jump into it in details because just from 1937 to the 1980s, 87 articles have been written about the validity of this. And there are people taking their stance in all sorts of positions. People that say it's completely useless, people that say it's 100% correct, and people that take a sort of middle ground. I take the middle ground. I believe that the nucleus, the core, speaking about Jesus and his execution are correct, but it is possible that both the resurrection and the mention of the word Messiah were added.
Of course you would take the middle ground. So let me get this straight. You have 87 sources here that definitely don't take the most recent information about this passage into consideration. How is this good historical research? Look, I know I'm just sort of an amateurish historian here, but even I know that you got to take the most recent scholarship into consideration when you form your opinion. Using scholarship from 1937 in order to form a modern opinion about anything in history without good reason, I think, is a bit ridiculous. And good reason would be that, nobody's refuted the particular scholarly position from 1937, or no work has been done on the field since 1937. But considering that more modern research has been done since 1987 on this particular subject, I would think it would behoove you as an amateur historian, at the very least, to look at the more recent scholarship on it. I like how he just sort of speculates about there being a previous version, a less Christianized version of the Testimonium Flavianum, and doesn't even address the fact that we have scholarship, modern scholarship, that points to the fact that there wasn't one that precedes Eusebius. He doesn't even address the fact that he speculates about there being a previous version of the Testimonium, but we don't have any evidence to suggest that there was a previous version. So he just conveniently strips the Testimonium of all its highly Christianized portions. You shouldn't do that without a good reason, and the only reason here seems to be that those particular portions of the Testimonium are problematic if Josephus wrote it. But even so, dropping those portions as interpolated doesn't even begin to address the problems with this reference, like the fact that it seems to be modeled directly off of the Emmaus Road story, or the fact that the basic grammar of this passage doesn't even match how Josephus writes. This is just a poor historical analysis of this passage.
It is also interesting to see that there is another writer, a Christian writer, the very first one to speak about this testimony specifically, and it's Origen. And hear what he says. Origen said of Josephus, although not far from the truth, he did not believe in Jesus as the Christ, an affirmation that was repeated in his Contra Celsum. Because of this, I believe that it's highly likely that he did actually mention Jesus Christ and the crucifixion, but he didn't mention the other two things. Otherwise, this Christian author wouldn't have even have any reason to complain.
This part is a little hard to understand. I think he's trying to support taking the middle ground here by suggesting that Origen mentions Josephus mentioning a Jesus, or mentioning him in some kind of way, but just not calling him the Christ. So he's good to accept the middle ground position on this passage. The problem is that this section of Origen doesn't even mention the Testimonium Flavianum. Both James Carleton Paget and Alice Wheatley demonstrate that Origen is not referencing this passage in Josephus. What particular historical research did he do on this passage? Because it seems to me like he did little to no research on it. It seems to me that he just read what was literally on the page, and then looked at a couple of scholarly sources, noticed that there was a fuck ton from 1937 to 1987, and then just formed an opinion on it based on no modern historical research. This is officially not an honest historical investigation. Alright, so now we get to Pliny the Younger. Let's see what Metatron thinks about Pliny the Younger's reference. I'm I cannot help but to think that he is not going to accept Pliny. He's definitely going to say that this is just talking about what Christians believed in the 2nd century, because that's the context surrounding Pliny the Younger. I hope I'm not wrong. Oh fuck, I'm wrong, aren't I? That's right, honey, I am wrong. Fuck me.
As far as the validity of Pliny the Younger's testimony, it's complete general consensus that it's authentic. Also because we have the letter of response of Emperor Trajan, which again speaks about the same thing, so the two things can be double-checked and cross-referenced. It's authentic.
Yes, Pliny did write his particular reference, but that doesn't say anything about Jesus existing. Pliny would have gotten his information from Christians in the 2nd century. He directly says this. They would have already had at least 3 gospels preached to them, if not 4. So it's no surprise that Pliny would report what he did, but it also means that we don't have an independent account for Jesus. Why does he even bring this up? He's not even doing source criticism on it. He should be rejecting this particular reference on context alone. Okay, now we get to his take on Suetonius. Okay, Suetonius does not talk about Christ. He talks about Christus. There's no way. He's got to say this is not a reference. He has to say that because it's not a reference. If you literally just read the fucking words on the page, it's not a reference to Jesus.
But most importantly, of historical significance, the mention of the instigator, meaning CHRESTUS, which is again a different spelling of Christus, both being a period for the time. Now, the validity of these testimonies at the moment is not questioned in the academia, and that is because you have to remember that the Romans were particularly meticulous when it came to both records, and these are all period.
Okay, Suetonius wouldn't have misspelled Christos with Christus. For one thing, Suetonius knows how to spell Christians. So if he meant Christos or Christians, he would have spelt it correctly. Also, the grammar of that particular section does not seem to indicate that Christ or, the savior of the Jews was the one that instigated anything, because the instigated word that's used there to describe Christus means that Christus is the person that instigated things. Considering that this was written in the 50s, there's no way that Jesus could have been the instigator. So this is just not a reference to Jesus at all. So this is yet another piece of evidence that he has looked at uncritically and seems to have done no critical source analysis on the passage. All he does is verify that the person that supposedly wrote it authentically wrote it, and then he speculates and changes things about the passage in order for it to support a historical Jesus. What the fuck is going on? Dishonesty is going on. Oh Christ. Next is Marbar Serapion. Why does anybody bring this motherfucker up? I don't know. Let's see what Metatron says about it.
Now, even though on this letter there is no mention of the word Christos or the name Christos, or should we say title, Messiah, it is still interesting because he does call him the King of the Jews, which we know was not only an expression that was not used by the Christians, but it was an expression that is linked to what was written on top of the cross of Jesus with the letters in re, which translate Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judae, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews.
Now, for Marbar Serapion, we can't really nail down a very specific date. The best that we can do is say that it was written sometime between 73 CE and the 3rd century. The most likely date is sometime in the mid-2nd century. The problem with that, though, is that it automatically rules him out as having any kind of independent knowledge about Jesus. The reason for this is that the Gospels were written so early in Christian history that by the time you get to the early to mid 2nd century, the idea that Jesus walked on earth and everything like that was already part of the Gospels. So any kind of information you pull from that point in time forward is going to be tainted by the Gospels. So the Christians that obviously informed Marbar Serapion about their faith knew about the Gospels and what they said and the story of Jesus. So, like, for instance, one of the particular teachings about Jesus that's contained in the Gospels and shows that the Christians that he got his information from are tainted by the Gospels is this whole idea that Jesus is the King of the Jews. It dates back to a prophecy in Isaiah 9:6-7 that claims that he will be the King of the Jews. Also, Mara connecting the death of this wise king to the destruction of the temple and blaming the Jews for his death show that he was definitely getting his information from the Gospels in one fashion or another. And since he got his information, either directly or indirectly, from the Gospels, that means that he is not an independent source of Jesus. And yet again, Metatron shows that he obviously has not done any kind of source criticism or historical research on the references that he's pulling up. If he had, he wouldn't have even mentioned Marbar Serapion. Now, I don't know what scholars he was looking at. My initial guess is that he was looking at Christian apologists, and maybe not historical scholars on this particular subject. A lot of Christian apologists like to tout themselves as being historians, like Mike Licona. Or Gary Habermas. The fact that you have to ignore information about a reference in order to make it work for your conclusion shows me that you're just being dishonest. Oh, now he's going to go over Lucian of Samosata. Great!
Now again, this is one of those non-Roman mentions that do not use the term Christ specifically, but they do mention the crucifixion. They call him a sage and a lawgiver. And also further on in his writing, Lucian mentions that the Christians were using sacred writings.
Okay, so Lucian's writing was done in 165 CE. That's the mid-2nd century. Considering that Christians would have known the gospel message, they would have been exposed to all of the quote-unquote historical stories about Jesus, kind of seems like he's most likely tainted. Just like I said before with Marbar Serapion and him writing in the mid-2nd century, the same time that Lucian's writing, they are both tainted by the gospel message. It just seems like this entire video is an example of how Metatron fails to do any kind of source criticism on the references that he's pulling up. Can you really trust any kind of historical information that he gives you? Because it seems like he doesn't know how to do any kind of historical research. I'm not saying this as some kind of like professional historian or anything like that. I don't have degrees, but I have been in this particular discussion long enough to know what proper source criticism and historical research looks like. This is not it. I mean, if he had done literally any kind of research on this particular passage, he would have found Robert Van Voorst saying this. Most of the correct information he relates about Christianity was common knowledge in his time. Robert Van Voorst, Jesus outside the New Testament. All right. So just close your eyes for a second and imagine that the only reason why we believe that the Titanic sank was because the grandson of a guy who knew a friend who heard about the Titanic sinking. That is the kind of evidence that Metatron has presented today. He's uncritically accepted every single reference he's brought up, as long as it was authentically written by the person, and it confirms his conclusion that Jesus existed. Whether or not it would be an independent source, which is what we really need in this discussion. After all this, I feel like Metatron has no idea how to do historical research, at least when it concerns Jesus. And he's gonna bring up the Talmud. Fucking great.
But we still have more. In the Jewish Talmud, we have a mention of the crucifixion of Christ, which is again a non-Christian mention. It reads, "On the eve of the Passover, Yeshu was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, 'He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf.' But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover." This was written between 70 and 200 AD.
Well, the date for the Jesus in the Talmud is more like 80 BCE. And that makes it about 100 years before the supposed Jesus of Christianity walked the earth. Any kind of basic research into this reference outside of Christian New Testament scholars would indicate that this is not the Jesus of the first century that started Christianity. He would know, for instance, that this Jesus was executed for sorcery, not blasphemy. And also, he was executed directly by the Jews and not the Romans. He was stoned, not crucified. He was executed at Lydda, not Jerusalem. And the disciples of this particular Jesus, they were all executed after Jesus was executed. Craig Evans, Graham Twelfthtree, and Peter Schaeffer all identified this Jesus as living in 80 BCE. This is just further proof that Metatron is not doing any kind of historical research. He's just finding references that confirm his already existing belief that Jesus existed. And he ignores any kind of evidence or arguments contrary to that belief. I have to say that this video is just not an honest investigation into the historical nature of Jesus. It seems like Metatron has just taken the New Testament scholarship hook, line, and sinker and is parroting their particular line. That is not an honest position to take, because the New Testament scholarship is quite nearly intellectually bankrupt. They are controlled by statements of faith. All in all, I feel like Metatron did a horrible job investigating the historical references to Jesus. He doesn't seem to do any kind of real historical research or source criticism on the references that he presents. Nothing here is anything new, but the one thing that is new is somebody claiming to be unbiased and doing an honest investigation into the non-Christian sources, but yet what he gives us are sources that are informed by the Christian sources. If you were to redo this video and say that we're not going to use the Gospels in order to prove that Jesus existed in history or anything based on the Gospels, then he would have to remove every single reference that he presented here. There's literally nothing that should convince you that Jesus did exist in history based on the evidence that he provided. Anyways, if you guys are interested in this particular discussion on whether or not Jesus existed, I do have an app called CHRESTUS. Definitely go check it out, download it. It's got a lot of great information in it. I'm working on getting the iOS updated to the newest framework, so just bear with me on that. Hopefully I can have it out by the end of the year. But if you will, go there, check that out, and I'd really appreciate it. But hey, before you go, why don't you go down below and leave me a comment? What did you think about his references? Do you think that he made some good points here, or do you think that he just uncritically looked at the information and accepted whatever the party line was? Let me know down below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like mythicist content like this. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.